joining us for this video in the Tiisa Group Glass Balls video series. My name is Denise Nell, and we'll be discussing ethics-related risks. We'll look at what some of these risks are in an organization, what the consequences are if these risks materialize, and then we'll spend some time on how to design and implement a practical ethics management program for your business. Let's get going. The risk of unethical behavior. It's also referred to as conduct risk. The risk relates to the behavior of individuals and whether they act in the best interest of the organization and its stakeholders. On the one hand, this could be individuals not acting in the best interest of the company, where they act in their own personal interest. Examples of this would be individuals defrauding the company, abusing or stealing company assets, benefiting from irregular procurement, conflicts of interests and/or bribes. Interesting, the Association for Fraud Examiners believe that organizations lose 5% of their revenue to fraud. On the other hand, this is much wider, and we have situations where the company is not acting in the best interest of their stakeholders, where top management is involved in misleading stakeholders. Steinhoff comes to mind. Volkswagen and their carbon emission scandal. What's important to note is that both of these have terrible consequences. Consequences could relate to an individual and/or an organization. An individual can lose his or her job and even get a criminal record. An organization incurs financial loss, not only due to fraud or irregular procurement, but also lawsuits that go with it. An organization can lose customer trust as a result of its damaged reputation, and/or even get fines from regulators for actions like bribes or inferior quality products. Staff morale and even staff turnover can also be impacted if unethical behavior is seen to be accepted in an organization. Imagine unethical behavior as cracks in the foundation of a building. Cracks that ultimately result in the building collapsing. These are all examples of companies that have had ethics-related risks materialize in the organization. And in one way or another, it had a huge impact on its reputation. So we know what these risks are. We know how terrible the consequences could be if they materialize. And we know that it's relevant to every organization. Then why do so few companies have a formal ethics management program in place? Perhaps you think it's too complicated. Let's see if we can convince you otherwise. Before we go into the details of an ethics management program, it's important to note that what you are trying to do is to build an ethical culture in your organization, a culture that everyone understands and signs up to. The program just gives some structure on how to focus your attention and prioritize initiatives for implementation. An ethics management program can be divided into the 6 elements shown on the diagram. Leadership commitment and governance, really setting the foundation of the program. And then looking at the actual risks that an organization faces to inform the specific ethics initiatives that it will then plan and implement over a specific period of time. The 5th one is an awareness and education campaign. As I said, we're trying to get everybody on the same page as to what the company stands for. And that's why awareness and education campaign is something that is really important in bringing this across. We'll touch on that later. Last but not least, we have reporting. Reporting is important because it shows you where you started, how you're progressing, and what difference you're actually making with this program. Let's look at each element in a bit more detail. Leadership commitment, also referred to as tone at the top, is probably the most important element of an ethics management program. Commitment not only to tick a box, but also a commitment to ethics that is lived throughout the organization every single day. You can't have ethics talk on the one hand and unethical behavior being demonstrated on the other. If this is the case, you will lose credibility and the program will fail. Governance. Let's look at 3 points. First one is policies. Now, the basic minimum policy that you should have is your code of ethics. And this, hopefully, most organizations do have. This doesn't have to be complicated, and it's important that it's written and contains all the elements that is required in a code of ethics. Second point, structures. Now, best practice will definitely be to have a social and ethics committee that governs the ethics management in your organization. However, the reality is that not all companies are going to implement that. So what is important at a minimum is to have it on the agenda of your exco meetings, of your board meetings. Thirdly, under governance, look at roles and responsibilities. It's important to document the roles and responsibilities of all the stakeholders in your ethics management program. What is the role of HR, finance? Who's the sponsor of the program? Will you have ethics champions? And if yes, what will their responsibilities be in implementation of the program? Clearly defined roles and responsibilities of all the role players involved in the program is a key ingredient for a successful program. Now that you have leadership commitment and governance in place, it's time to move on to the ethics risk assessment. The purpose of an ethics risk assessment is to understand the organization's exposure to the risk of unethical behavior, so that it can ultimately inform the rest of your ethics management program. What you think is going on might be quite different to the reality on the ground. So what I'd recommend is taking some time to understand what is going on, to understand what the current state of ethics is in the organization. One way to do this is to launch an anonymous survey to staff. This survey will not only show commitment that leadership is taking this seriously, but it also provides an opportunity for underlying issues and perceptions to come to light. Another input could be to review disciplinary hearings to understand what type of behaviors are taking place. Is sexual harassment an issue, for example? Is fraud happening and being identified? Performing interviews, not only with senior management, but across the board. This will give you an opportunity to understand what employees are feeling, to have a discussion and understand what their concerns are. And also importantly, what the program would need to achieve for them to deem the program to be successful. Once you have all this input, you need to assess the situation. And you need to understand the areas of the organization that needs to be prioritized on this journey of building an ethical culture. This will then ultimately inform what your ethics initiatives will be. To recap, this diagram shows how you use different tools like surveys, etc., to inform your ethics risk assessment and ultimately to understand the impact and the likelihood of your ethics-related risks, like fraud, bribery, sexual harassment. And once you have that understanding, this provides the input into your program, the input to have relevant, risk-prioritized, specific ethics initiatives. Let's look at some of those initiatives. This diagram shows some of the topics that may be prioritized as an output of your ethics risk assessment. For each one of these topics, you will need to define your initiative based on your current status. You need to think about what you want to achieve. You need to think about whether there is a policy that governs what you want to achieve and what you want the policies in your organization to be. Is there a process or processes in place that support the policies? And then lastly, What are the awareness and communication requirements? The awareness and communication requirements will then inform the next element of the ethics management program, being the awareness and communication campaign. But before we start with that, let's look at each one of these risk prioritized topics. Basics is listed as the first one, because that might be where you need to start. To look at the basics of what you want the ethics principles to be in your organization. To set up a code of ethics, for example. Ethics declaration. This is in many cases more of a compliance element, but quite important if you want to take disciplinary action against staff. To have a formal declaration process where people confirm that they have read your code of ethics and that they will comply. The more important thing is actually obviously the rest of the program where you will unpack elements of your code of ethics and make sure that your employees understand and buy into it. Conflicts of interest, this is really also one which I think is relevant in most organizations. And there are a number of different ways you can do it. On the one hand, you can ask people to declare whether they have any conflicts. But that one, is quite subjective because if somebody wants to really hide it, they're just not going to declare it. So it is important for discipline and it's important to make sure employees understand that you're looking at it, but it's not going to identify everything. What you can do is you can do different checks on conflicts. You can, for example, match all your employee payroll bank account numbers with all your supplier bank account numbers. Interesting if you do find a match. Again, I always think that people won't be that stupid to use the same bank account, but it has been noted that it does get picked up that way. Again, it's just a way of, it's easy enough to do, and it's just a way of checking that whether you are exposed. Third parties, if you have suppliers and you have an association risk with suppliers, this is something that you can or may decide to prioritize. Where you do a project, look at what third parties your organization has, and how are you going to make sure that your risks relating to those third parties, which are not only ethics related risks, how they actually are mitigated. Gifts. Do you have a gifts and entertainment policy? Do people even know what is acceptable or not acceptable? Really important to get that in place and documented. Company assets. Do people know what they can and can't use? Recruitment process. This is an area we touched on before, nepotism, where you need to make sure that your recruitment process is transparent and clear and mitigates the risk of nepotism. How many people do you have that does interviews? How many people do you have that actually decides on appointment? Do you ask the question before the interview whether the person knows the candidate? Last but not least, anonymous hotline. This is a very important element also in showing commitment from leadership in that they take this seriously. If you do not have an anonymous hotline, make sure people know where to report concerns that they may have on anything relating to ethics. These were just some thoughts on the topics and what you may or may not decide to incorporate into your initiative. I didn't go through the policy and processes in detail because that would be specific to each organization. But what is important to note that you need to make sure that your requirements for each one of these topics is listed somewhere that people can refer to and that you can then incorporate as you move forward into your awareness and education campaign. We mentioned before that what we're trying to do is we're trying to change behavior. We're trying to make sure that everybody signs up to the ethical principles that the organization stands for. And we're implementing initiatives to make sure that everybody knows what they are. So once you've defined your priorities and you know how you want to go about achieving them, you need to design a program that will drive the change in behavior that you want to see. So instead of randomly sending emails when a new policy is defined, You need to think through the communication requirements of each initiative. You need to align your messaging and make sure that you are consistently and creatively communicating the relevant messages to the different role players in the organization. Let's look at this in a bit more detail. A successful ethics awareness and education campaign is about getting the relevant messages to specific groups of people over a period of time using different mediums. It is just not good enough to expect employees to comply to a set of policies that are somewhere saved on a portal or an intranet site, but nobody ever talks about. Or even worse, expecting them to know what you expect of them in terms of behavior, but not having anything documented anywhere that actually explains it. But let's assume you have specific messages that you need to communicate to support these initiatives that you are going to be implementing over a specific period of time. And let's look at how we would then plan an awareness campaign to support that. Messaging, audience, frequency, and mediums. Those are the building blocks. Let's start with audiences. You need to define the different audiences in your organization. Let's think of a few. Exco will be an audience that might need different messaging than HR, for example. Your general users will be an audience that does need a specific type of messaging, but not the same as finance, for example, depending on the topic. Think about how much more effective it would be if you only communicated relevant messages to the different audiences. And that brings me to the next one, is messaging. Once you have your audiences defined, you need to look at the different topics and you need to understand what the messaging is that is relevant to the specific topic. Let's take conflicts of interest as an example. It might not be a message that you need to unpack in detail for every single junior resource in the organization, but it might be a very important topic for your buyers or anybody that has the power to actually make a purchasing decision. So I think you get my point. The relevant message needs to go to the relevant audience. Now let's look at frequency. Is it enough to communicate once? No, it isn't. You need to communicate these messages to the different audiences over a specific period of time, over and over again, using different mediums. One of the other reasons it's important to plan this campaign is the fact that you can combine messages. You may decide to have a quarterly session where you discuss certain topics. And that doesn't mean that it has to be a separate session for each initiative. You combine it. You need to think big picture and you need to put yourself in the shoes of the person receiving the messages to make it as painless and fun as possible for them to take in the messages and understand the why around some of the policies. The mediums is where you can start having fun. This is probably one of the few places where, as a risk or an ethics professional, you can live out your creativity. You can be creative in the way that you communicate to the employees in the organization. We need to move away from pure online training. There is a place for online training, and I understand that it's important for compliance purposes, for reporting purposes, but it isn't good enough to change behavior. So some of the examples of mediums that we've used before include board games. There are some very creative ways that you can bring across messages and concepts to people. Screensavers, where you animate specific topics and you actually subconsciously make people aware of different messages. You could start an initiative where you have conversations, ethics conversations, where quarterly you take a topic like conflicts or like gifts, and you actually have a conversation session with management where you explain what the company's stance is on these topics, and you offer employees the opportunity to ask questions to make sure they understand why. You could think of launching a rewards program where different business units compete against each other to see who completes the e-learning first. Unfortunately, this step in most cases doesn't get the priority it deserves. In most cases, there is so much focus on getting the initiative or the policy out, if that is even a priority, that spending time to creatively think through, plan, and focus on how the relevant audiences are going to consume the policy requirements really isn't the priority. With this topic of ethics, as we said many times, it's about behavior. And it's about people buying into and signing up to what an organization stands for. And you just don't get that with a policy somewhere on a website. The last element of an ethics management program we're going to look at is reporting. Reporting progress on the agreed program is one side of the coin. But the other, more important side is showing how the program is strengthening the organization against unethical risks. You can use regular surveys as one way of assessing the perceptions about the program and ethics in general. Other indicators could be reporting whether the number of fraud cases have decreased, whether you found instances of unethical behavior in your reviews of, say, supplier conflicts. What is coming out of the anonymous hotline reports? One tends to think that ethical reporting is only about the negative, but how nice would it be to also report positive examples of ethical behavior? Building an ethical culture is not a once-off exercise. It's a journey that management embarks on and continues to prioritize to make sure that everyone understands and buys into the ethical principles that the organization stands for. It's about making sure the foundation of the organization is strong enough, not only to carry the current organization, but also for sustainable growth into the future. I hope that this video gave you some insight into why it is important to intentionally focus on ethics in your organization and provided some structure on how to approach it. At Tiisa Group, it is our passion to help build successful and resilient businesses. We know that you are juggling many balls, and our role is to help you keep the glass balls, like ethics, in the air. Whether you need help with a specific element or need someone to design and implement an entire ethics management program, we'd be happy to help. Good luck on this journey of strengthening your organization against the risk of unethical behavior. Thanks for listening.